I am a great admirer of Dayan's articles because he actually thinks things through. And so I always read what Dayan writes. And I mean, in his more recent article now, I'm more in disagreement because I feel he's going a little out of his way to promote and to see the good in the JVP. I liked him more when he was making a critique of the government. Then I can see that critique very well, and I appreciate the critiques that he was making. But now he's shifted more into a supportive mode. Anyway, that's by the way, as an introduction. The thought that I had when you spoke about I think Natasha, about unilateralism and applied it internationally to the US, then my mind went to Sri Lanka. And I thought, actually, if you substitute Sri Lankan government or the Sinhalese majority for US, it fits. The same unilateralism you see that the US is doing, wanting to dominate, I see the Sri Lankan government or the Sinhala-dominated Sri Lankan government also practicing. And that's a challenge. I mean, it's not just the US, but it is also applicable in a more micro setting in Sri Lanka. And then I thought, I mean, when you said, Natasha, about that America won't want us, the US won't want a strong Russia, and I thought, oh, yes, in the same way that the Sinhala majority or the Sri Lankan government or state wouldn't want a strong North and East or Northern province. They wouldn't want it because the threat to national security. That's how it was seen. So I just want to draw that sort of line of thinking that went through my head. But I think the issue of unilateralism is a big problem in our country, where essentially because they had a permanent Sinhala majority and permanent Tamil and Muslim minorities, there's that issue is there. It has been always there, and we have to find a way to tackle it. Now, of course, internationally too, we must find some solution. What's happening in Gaza, Palestine is terrible. But I just thought of bringing in that point that unilateralism not only applies internationally, but even within our own country.
Thank you. I'll try to keep it short. Natasha's, I remember that early quote, the first quote about the United States not allowing Russia or China to punch its natural weight in the world order. That comes from a piece that appeared in the spring of 2012. That's a long time ago. It was written at the end of 2011 when I was serving in Paris. And it appeared in a journal based in Moscow and Paris and Geneva called Security Index. So what seems current now, I had said at that time, that, because at that time, Russia and China were both talking about their partnership with the West. And I was saying, look, guys, you're never going to be allowed a role commensurate with your sense of self-worth. Not necessarily all your aspirations, but your basic self-worth. Now, connecting up via what Jehan said with Kusum's hot button question, when Natasha says unilateralism, it's actually a kind of a couplet. It's unilateralism / unipolarity. Because there are essays in that collection, and one of my main themes is to search for what I call a counter-hegemonic, counter-unipolar global strategy. This is a value I hold dear domestically as well. And if there is any consistency, it's not that I've sat around trying to figure out consistencies in what I've said and written, but it strikes me that one of those consistencies would be a balance of power approach. I have always resisted domestic political unipolarity. Just as I resist, perhaps even more so because I happen to live here, I resist domestic political unipolarity. And that has been a common thread going back decades, literally decades. So I do tend to tilt when I feel the balance needs to be redressed. Some people would see that as inconsistent. Those who are familiar with the realist school and the theory and practice of the balance of power would understand that. So that's my answer to what Jehan is saying. As for what Kusum was bringing up, my what seems like my latest phase. Now that Rajiva is here, Rajiva has this delightful story which I had forgotten, but I mean it's true since he says in 1984. This was at he relates it better than I do. But he says it was at Radhika Kumaraswamy's birthday party. And Rajiva had asked me, this was what, 1983 or 84 or something like that. And he had asked me, they say you're Stalinist, is it true? And Rajiva recounts that to his horror, I had looked him straight in the eye and said yes. So I think that what seems to be inconsistent could be merely sort of circularity in terms of my latest writing, but I'm just joking. No, look, if you take the book, another consistency I would identify, and I would almost say is a kind of character running through all these articles, is the crisis. The crisis. There's this long Sri Lankan crisis. My first book, which came out in 1995 in Delhi, published by Vikas, was called, I mean, it is a long title which I didn't give. Vikas gave it, but my original title is the subtitle of the book on the cover. It's Unfinished War, Protracted Crisis. Vikas called it Travails of a Democracy. But this has been a consistent preoccupation because that was the reality we were living. At that time, unfinished war, protracted crisis. Then I have two books which I'm very proud of because they were published overseas and are the products of scholarly research on subjects that were not Sri Lankan. My book on Fidel and my book on the fall of global socialism. And that's about the global crisis of socialism, of a certain project, and an exception that I saw in terms of Fidel Castro. And then you have the book just before this one, Long War, Cold Peace. And there again, you're talking about a crisis. Today, the swerve that, and I use the word swerve intentionally, that Kusum sees, a swerve to the left. Well, those who know my background know that it may not, it's not so much a swerve as kind of a, in a way, a return, God knows for how long, but anyway, Comrade Dew, Sarat here, those who have known me as a boy would say, that's what he always was, or that's where he's coming from. But right now, it's still the crisis. And this time, the crisis has taken a shape and form that has shocked me almost as much as July 83 did. Because when we have a situation in which, and here we have to thank the UNDP material, which has now gone into the World Bank reports, we have 1% of the populace which enjoys 31% of the wealth and 50% of the populace which enjoys less than 4%. You have the most shocking social crisis. And this was not because anybody messed up for 76 years. It's something that is post-war, perhaps even only a decade old. Yes, never. It's absolutely unprecedented, except for maybe 10 years. And this is, as Dr. Howard Nichols, who told me he's going to be back in Holland and therefore unable to be here today, says, our economic crisis is at its core a debt crisis which in itself has at its heart the ISB debt. Now we know who took most of that. I don't want to get into parties. But when you have an establishment that has brought us to this point of this crisis, which we need not have been in, and that's a bipartisan establishment. My point is, I'll be damned if I'm going to quibble and say that they have a right to rule or that they're better than the other lot for some reason because the other guys weren't responsible for this. And my problems with the JVP were really serious. I mean, we were killing each other in the civil war, within the civil war that took place in the 80s. So I've seen the worst of these guys. But I also know that the same guys are not around. Most of them are not. I mean, I can't think of a single one in the present lot who participated in the killing of civilians because almost all of those were killed. So when I look at the crisis, I then rule out, and I feel that as an intellectual, I cannot recommend any political party or entity that is not at least repentant for what they did, including amassing that debt, and is determined to go down the same path of making us worthy of being indebted again, because that's the whole strategy. We'll get a clean bill of health if we do this austerity stuff, and we'll erase the state from the economy, and then we'll be able to go back to the private money markets. It doesn't make sense to me. So I look at the JVP NPP, and the NPP is not just a mask, because you won't be able to get those tens of thousands of women if it was just the JVP saying the JVP thing. You go out there and listen to what's being said. People are talking about Malimav, not Janata Vimukti Peram. It's of course there's the core Marxist, Leninist, communist JVP driving it, but it's something that's something more than that. They've grown, or they have an auxiliary which has grown beyond perhaps what they themselves thought. That's why you have the hammer and sickle, day before yesterday, but you don't have our honored ancestors' faces back there, no Marx, Engels, Lenin. And something is happening. As an analyst, I have to take into account not just the big crowd in Colombo, and I watched the slow motion, I watched the fast thing, and there are photographs which tell me that young people, especially young women, whom one might have thought would be marching for the SJB, are actually marching for the NPP. I mean, you can tell the class background from the photographs. Something is happening. But what impressed me most is not the crowd in Colombo, is that they could sustain till past nightfall massive crowds in Colombo and Matara at the same time. So, as a realist, I understand that something is happening which maybe, I mean, I wasn't alive, but from my reading and from what my dad has told me was what was happening in 1956, a kind of a tectonic shift. So that plus the culpability in terms of policy, morals, ethics of the old establishment, bipartisan establishment, makes me look far more charitably at the other force that we have around. And as far as I'm concerned, our political system faced down the JVP at its most violent, crushed it. I myself was part of that civil war within a civil war. Rehabilitated it, and now it's there as a reserve force for us to use, bring in, to right the balance and think of other ways perhaps of getting out of the crisis, negotiating in a tougher way with the international system. So those guys will think, hey, these guys are a bunch of leftists, we'd better kind of go easy, they're so crazy, we don't know what they'll do. And then the Chinese might come back. So why not? I mean, scare the system. I think these middle class, there's a lot of professors, they've come of age. They've grown, as in 56, where a rural middle class had grown into something else, what Marshall Singer called the emerging elite. That's what has happened. There's a political sociology behind the NPP, the JVP NPP. The JVP itself has gentrified. So there's something there, and I'm not going to be blind to that. I fought them at their worst, and I am perfectly willing to commend them in their present state because I don't see anybody else. I wish the SJB had taken the advice of Lakshman Vatavela in the Daily Mirror yesterday, saying, go back to the policies of Ranasinghe Premadasa and face this crisis. I remember when he said that at the first big conclave of the SJB professionals. He was one of the speakers. I didn't attend, but I was listening. Maim was there, I believe, 2 years ago. And Iran Vikramaratne, responding, closing the event, picked out what Lakshman Bhattabhala said and said, that was then, that was the past. And policies will now be decided in a collegiate manner. So, here is an option that has opted not to take a progressive, populist, centrist path which would have posited an alternative to the JVP, but has decided to polarize this on right-left lines. I don't hear the JVP using the old Marxist-Leninist ideology. The only people talking about Marx, Engels, and Lenin today is the right. And that worries me because it tells me that whoever wins the next election, I'm not making predictions, you may unwittingly have a highly charged, polarized situation which leads to political conflict. It's the right that's starting this, not the left. And the center has disappeared because one lot have decided to ally with Ranil, that's the SLPP and the SLFP, and the others have decided to abandon, except for the most tokenistic mentions of Ranasinghe Premadasa, every possible major policy, whether it's on sovereignty or the role of the state that he had, in favor of something that they openly admit is not strategically different from Ranil's policy. Now, Charita Herath, who's here, actually raised a question on television. He said, why has the main parliamentary opposition, which quite rightly is challenging the JVP NPP to a debate on economics, not challenge the government to a debate on economics? Don't they have any differences with the government on economic policy? There was no answer. So that is why it's not that I'm entranced by the JVP NPP, and I could, if I were going to do a political science lecture thing, there's at least one former student of mine seated here who knows exactly who still hasn't forgiven me an A minus, and knows how rigorous I can be. And I can tell you all the mistakes the JVP and NPP are making. But to me, that's not the big picture. The big picture is the crisis, the role played by the parties of the establishment, the rightward shift of a potential of a naturally centrist party, the main opposition party, and the only default option left to us. Thank you.